Peter Hitchens. Why a book called The Abolition of Britain?
Because it's important for two reasons. One, because Britain is a fantastically important country in the history of the world and in the history of democracy and liberty. And secondly, because here in the United States, I think people ought to be aware of the dangers to their own culture and politics, which are apparent here, but have not got anything like as far as they have in Britain, but which can overturn in a surprisingly short period of time what looked like an established and settled civilization. What a lot of people don't realize is just how unlike Britain now is, and how completely transformed it has been by a cultural revolution over the past 30 and 40 years.
In your introduction, you write, the influence of American culture on this country has turned out to be one of the great paradoxes of modern history. The arsenal of conservatism and capitalism has done more to eat away at British self-confidence and British institutions than the Soviet Union or the Communist Party ever did. Explain.
Well, what I mean there, and some people in Britain have wrongly accused me of anti-Americanism, which anybody who knows me knows is not the case, is that we took from America some of the bad things and not enough of the good things. Therefore, we tended to take the culture of a very big and a very unsettled country, particularly during the Second World War, when we had a huge American presence in our midst. And that simply wasn't fitted for our much smaller, more intimate, more settled, more restrained culture, and it hasn't worked. And it's really one of the great shames that by closer association with an ally from whom we could learn a great deal, we've actually succeeded in learning all the wrong things. And instead of looking, for instance, at our Constitution and saying, well, perhaps there are important ways in which we could defend our liberties in the future, we've done stupid things like begin to get rid of the jury system, for instance, amazing for the country which invented it, and reduce the powers of Parliament and increase the powers of lawyers. But at the same time, from America, we've taken cultural things which are all to do with straightforward materialism and to do with a Hollywood series of morals which don't really fit in our, as I say, much more intimate, more old-fashioned society.
On the back of your book, this note: Tony Blair's cool Britain is also a site of junk culture, showbiz values, pernicious officialdom, and fifth-rate political manipulation. It simultaneously illustrates much of the worst of elitism and the worst of populism. Reading this honest and indignant account, I could not repress a twinge of fraternal solidarity.
Well, that's, of course, my brother Christopher, with whom I disagree on practically everything. But I'm really touched by this by this recommendation. I just put it down to the fact that the one thing we both have, even if it has completely different results, is independence of mind. It doesn't make you like the same thing generally, but it certainly does make you dislike the same things, humbug, phonies. And I think he spotted what a lot of other people have now begun to spot in our Prime Minister, Mr. Blair, that dreadful phoniness, which is one of the very important developments of modern politics.
What do you mean by phoniness?
Well, first of all, it's all baby talk and propaganda and no substance. There is a true purpose in the new British government. Well, it's not that new now, it's had 3 years, which is quite a serious purpose, which is to absorb Britain, United Kingdom, into the European Union and effectively end it as an independent nation. But they never say that. They never talk about that. They just make noisy, sloganizing attacks on opposition parties for sleaze, as they call it, though they themselves are not immune from it. And they shout about the improvements they're going to make in healthcare and schooling, which they don't make. And the whole tone of political debate is lowered, and it's become incredibly televisual and soundbite dominated in a way which British politics certainly wasn't until very recently.
When did you have your confrontation with Tony Blair?
My main one during the last election. I've had a few, but it was a particular moment when I put to him that his own manifesto was being profoundly misleading about education. He claimed that he wanted for everybody else what he wanted for his own children. It just so happened that what he'd arranged for his own children was, first of all, not available to most British people, and secondly, would be less available to them under the plans that he was proposing. He got very, very upset and told me to sit down and stop being bad. He didn't take any more questions from me after that.
Are British journalists different than American journalists?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, there has been in the past, I think, more separation between press and government press and political parties. I have to say, another thing that the Blair government has fostered has been this incredible closeness between White House press corps and White House, and there is an attempt to turn British political journalism into an adjunct of number 10 Downing Street and of the government, which is really quite startling and to me rather creepy. And it is changing, but I think we have been a little bit more adversarial most of the time and a little bit more disrespectful, and we tend to think that we can be disrespectful to our politicians because we have a monarchy and we don't need to be respectful to them. We can revere our head of state without getting involved in politics.
Where do you work on a full-time basis?
I work for the London Daily Express newspaper as a weekly columnist, and that's my main activity. I also write for other British publications, The Spectator and Prospect particularly, but that's my main activity.
How many years did you live in the United States?
Only two very intense years, which I still look back on with enormous affection and long to come back. But you can't always choose where and when you live, and it made a huge impression upon me, and as did my 2.5 years in the Soviet Union before that, and probably made the faults of my home country much clearer to me than they would otherwise have been.
How big is Great Britain in population?
We're about just under 60 million.
What state in America could Great Britain fit in?
Oh, most of them, I should think. It's really quite small. You could certainly get it easily into California and easily into Alaska. And in fact, California, by comparison, is probably rather a bigger country. But I think that we have, because of our history and because of our particular island position, we've developed a separate civilization which has got very little to do with size and a lot more to do with culture and civilization.
What's left of the empire?
Nothing. A few small windswept, damp islands, I suppose, such as the Falklands, you could claim, and I think St. Helena and Tristan da Cunha are another little dots on the map, but nothing. It's gone. It no longer exists. We got rid of it with amazing speed, and there is this thing called the Commonwealth, which is really just a club of people who pretend that they still have something in common but don't. It's amazing how quickly it's vanished from sight.
You started at, where you were born down south, Portsmouth? Or
I was actually born in the Empire. I was born on the island of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean, which was then the great British naval base in the Mediterranean. And now, of course, it hasn't seen a British warship for years. It's an independent country.
But didn't you grow up in, like, Southampton?
I grew up all over the place because of my father's career in the Navy. We were in naval bases, in some of them in the south of England, in Portsmouth and Plymouth, once in Scotland, and those are my earliest memories of these rather strange places full of great grey warships and very serious people, and often quite badly bomb damaged by what was then a recent war.
The reason I asked that, though, if you drove from the south of Great Britain to the top, how long is it? How far away is it?
I think it probably adds up to about 600 miles if you do it from Land's End to John O'Groats. I've never done it quite like that, but it's small. You could do it if you really tried. I think probably in just over a day, but you'd see an immense variety while you were doing it.
What's the ethnic population, or what kind of diversity is there in Great Britain?
Well, there are, for a start, there are 4 different nations in the British Isles: the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, and the English. And they're all to be found on the English half of the 2 islands, whereas in Ireland itself the division is actually more between Irish and Scots, although people tend to forget that. And they mingle a great deal. They mingle more probably in England than anywhere else. Scotland is more Scottish, Welsh more Welsh, England much more of a mixture. And then we've had successive waves of immigration. The whole country is an immigrant country from its earliest years, because a lot of the population really comes from the North German plains anyway. But then you've had French Huguenots and Eastern European Jews and Hungarians and all kinds of other people coming in. And then in the recent 40, 50 years, quite a large number of people from the old empire, either from the West Indies or from the Indian subcontinent.
Christopher Hitchens, your brother, is older or younger?
He's older.
Are your parents alive?
No.
How did 2 people come out of the same family with such divergent views?
Well, I suppose part of it must be that if there's two of you, you're bound to assert your individuality by being different from one another. But apart from that, I don't actually think that if you really looked at it, our views are that divergent. What we both do is look critically and independently at the world and reach different conclusions. But those conclusions do come from a similar, I believe, regard for the truth and for justice and for a number of other things, which simply lead us to different conclusions. You can't expect everyone to come to the same conclusion about how an objective should be reached, but I think it's quite reasonable to assume that they have the same motives.